Right now, your arteries could be silently narrowing without you feeling a single symptom. And what you eat today may decide whether that process accelerates or reverses in the coming years. Doctors have long prescribed statins to manage cholesterol, but emerging nutritional research suggests there may be two everyday foods that challenge everything you thought you knew about arterial plaque buildup. Before you dismiss this as hype, you need to hear what a cardiologist recently revealed about how these specific foods interact with inflammation, blood flow, and the hidden drivers of heart disease. What you are about to learn next. In this video, we break down two surprising foods that may support arterial health in ways most people overlook. A cardiologist explains the science behind how they may influence plaque buildup and cardiovascular risk. Most people think heart disease starts and ends with cholesterol. That's the simplified story you've probably heard for years. LDL goes up, plaque builds up, arteries clog, and statins come in to manage the numbers. But inside modern cardiology, a more complex picture has emerged, one where inflammation, not just cholesterol, plays a central role in what actually damages your arteries over time. And this is where things start to get interesting. Because while most discussions focus on lowering cholesterol, fewer people talk about what drives the arterial damage in the first place. Chronic, low-grade inflammation inside the blood vessel walls. This inflammation doesn't happen overnight. It builds silently, often for years, slowly weakening the inner lining of your arteries and making it easier for plaque to form, stick, and eventually become dangerous. Now here's the controversial part. Some cardiologists and nutritional researchers are beginning to look beyond medications and focus on specific dietary patterns and foods that may help calm the inflammatory process at its source. One food in particular keeps showing up in these discussions, not because it's exotic or expensive, but because it's deceptively simple and widely available. It's the kind of food most people underestimate, even though it has been consumed for centuries in traditional diets associated with lower cardiovascular risk. What makes this food stand out isn't just what it contains, but how it interacts with the body's inflammatory signaling pathways. Inside your arteries, inflammation is regulated by complex biological mechanisms involving oxidative stress, immune response, and endothelial function. The health of the inner lining of your blood vessels. When these systems are out of balance, the artery walls become more vulnerable to plaque accumulation and damage. This is where certain bioactive compounds found in this overlooked food may play a role. Researchers have observed that these compounds can influence oxidative stress levels, which are closely tied to inflammation. In simpler terms, they may help reduce the irritation occurring inside the artery walls that contributes to long-term damage. But here's where you need to be careful with interpretation. This does not mean a single food can reverse years of arterial plaque buildup. That would be an oversimplification, and not how human biology works. Cardiovascular disease is multifactorial, meaning it develops from a combination of diet, genetics, lifestyle, stress, sleep, and metabolic health. However, what makes this food worth attention is its potential role in supporting a less inflammatory internal environment. Think of it less as a cleaner of arteries and more as a modifier of conditions that allow damage to progress in the first place. Some early studies suggest that regular consumption of foods rich in specific polyphenols and anti-inflammatory compounds may support endothelial function. The endothelium is crucial because it controls how blood flows, how vessels expand, and how the body responds to stress inside the arteries. When it functions well, the environment inside your blood vessels is less likely to promote plaque instability. That stability matters more than most people realize, because the real danger in heart disease is not just plaque presence, it's plaque behavior. Some plaques remain stable for years without causing issues, while others become inflamed and rupture, leading to serious cardiovascular events. Understanding what influences that stability is one of the most important areas of ongoing research, and diet appears to be one of those influencing factors. Still, this is where many people go wrong. They hear anti-inflammatory food and assume it's a magic bullet. In reality, the effect, if present, is subtle, cumulative, and dependent on the broader context of your lifestyle. No cardiologist would suggest replacing prescribed medication with a single dietary change. Instead, what is being explored is whether certain foods can complement medical treatment by supporting healthier vascular conditions over time. So, when we talk about this overlooked food, we're not talking about a miracle cure. We're talking about a piece of a much larger puzzle, one that includes inflammation control, metabolic health, and long-term cardiovascular resilience. And once you understand that distinction, the conversation about heart health changes completely. Because the question is no longer just how do you lower cholesterol. It becomes, how do you create an internal environment where your arteries are less likely to deteriorate in the first place? That shift in thinking is where the real discussion begins, and it leads directly into the next surprising factor that most people completely overlook. Most people assume plaque inside arteries is static buildup, but in reality, it is dynamic biological material that responds to what you eat, how you move, and even how your body manages inflammation. And this is where omega-3 rich foods enter the conversation in cardiology, discussions about arterial health. Unlike simple cholesterol-lowering approaches, omega-3 fatty acids appear to interact more deeply with the inflammatory pathways involved in plaque formation. Research has explored how these compounds may contribute to the production of specialized molecules called resolvins, which help regulate inflammation resolution inside the body. This is important because plaque stability depends not only on how much cholesterol is present, but also on whether the immune system is actively inflaming the arterial wall. When inflammation is high, plaques become more vulnerable to rupture, which is the event that often triggers serious cardiovascular complications. Omega-3 rich fish such as salmon, sardines, and mackerel have been studied for their potential to influence triglyceride levels and support vascular function. Some cardiologists emphasize that this does not mean these foods remove plaque directly, but rather may shift the biological environment in which plaque develops. This distinction is critical because many people mistakenly interpret nutritional effects as direct reversal mechanisms, when in reality, the process is more gradual and systemic. What makes omega-3 intake especially interesting in this context is its relationship with endothelial function, the thin layer of cells lining your blood vessels, which plays a major role in regulating vascular tone and inflammation. When endothelial function improves, blood flow becomes more efficient, and the internal environment of arteries becomes less conducive to inflammatory buildup. Still, it is important to avoid oversimplification because cardiovascular health is influenced by a wide range of variables, including genetics, physical activity, stress, and overall dietary pattern. A cardiologist would typically frame this as supportive evidence rather than a standalone treatment strategy, meaning it complements rather than replaces medical therapy. The emerging interest in dietary compounds like omega-3 fatty acids reflects a broader shift in medicine toward understanding how inflammation, resolution, and vascular biology interact over time. And this sets the stage for the next critical piece of the puzzle, because even within nutrition, there is another overlooked factor that may significantly influence how plaques behave inside your Arteries. That factor is often described in research as lipid metabolism modulation, which refers to how fats are processed, transported, and stored in the bloodstream. Omega-3 intake has been associated with lower circulating triglycerides, which are another type of blood fat that contributes to cardiovascular strain when elevated. Some studies also suggest improvements in arterial elasticity, meaning blood vessels can expand and contract more effectively under pressure. This does not eliminate existing plaque, but it may reduce the likelihood that plaques become unstable or rupture unexpectedly. And that is the key distinction cardiologists often emphasize when discussing dietary interventions versus pharmaceutical treatments. In clinical practice, statins remain one of the most well-studied interventions for lowering LDL cholesterol and reducing cardiovascular risk, but they operate primarily through enzymatic pathways. In the liver, nutritional approaches like omega-3 rich diets work differently by influencing multiple systems simultaneously rather than targeting a single biochemical pathway. This systems-level effect is one reason researchers are increasingly interested in dietary patterns rather than isolated nutrients alone. However, it is essential to interpret these findings cautiously because not all studies show uniform results, and individual responses can vary significantly. What remains consistent across most cardiology perspectives is the importance of reducing chronic inflammation, supporting vascular health, and maintaining metabolic balance over long periods of time. And when viewed through that lens, omega-3 rich foods become part of a larger conversation about prevention rather than reaction in heart disease management. Which brings us to the next important question: how do these two dietary approaches interact together in real-world cardiovascular outcomes? And what does the evidence actually suggest about their combined effect on arterial plaque progression? This is where the discussion becomes especially controversial among experts today. Most debates around heart health eventually reach a controversial crossroads where diet and medication are placed against each other as if they are competing solutions rather than parts of a broader system. But in cardiology research, this framing is increasingly seen as misleading because cardiovascular disease does not respond to single-factor thinking. Statins primarily work by inhibiting an enzyme involved in cholesterol production in the liver, which leads to measurable reductions in LDL levels and a corresponding decrease in long-term cardiovascular risk in many patients. However, they do not directly target inflammation in the same way dietary compounds are being investigated for. This is where omega-3 rich foods and polyphenol-dense dietary patterns enter the discussion, not as replacements for medication, but as modulators of biological processes that influence how plaque behaves over time. Some researchers propose that when these dietary factors are combined with statin therapy, the overall effect on inflammation and lipid stability may be more significant than either approach alone. Despite the optimism surrounding nutritional interventions, the scientific community remains divided on the extent to which specific foods can meaningfully alter established arterial plaque in humans. Most clinical evidence supports the idea that while diet can significantly reduce risk factors such as inflammation, blood pressure, and triglycerides, reversal of existing plaque is far more complex and not guaranteed. This nuance is critical because public discussions often oversimplify cardiovascular health into a binary choice between medication and natural approaches, when in reality both may operate on different layers of the same disease process. The interaction between statins and dietary patterns is therefore better understood as complementary, where pharmacological intervention manages biochemical pathways while nutrition influences systemic inflammatory load. In this model, foods rich in omega-3 fatty acids and antioxidant compounds do not compete with medication, but may enhance the overall environment in which cardiovascular healing processes occur. However, translating these findings into real-world outcomes requires caution because human studies vary widely in design, population, and duration, making definitive conclusions difficult. What remains consistent across most cardiology perspectives is that reducing inflammation, improving lipid profiles, and supporting vascular function are central pillars of long-term heart health management. And while debates continue about the relative impact of diet versus medication, most experts agree that lifestyle patterns as a whole carry significant influence over cardiovascular outcomes. This includes not only what is eaten, but also how often physical activity occurs, how stress is managed, and how consistently sleep supports metabolic regulation. In this broader context, foods like omega-3 rich fish and polyphenol-dense plant sources are best viewed as supportive elements within a multi-layered strategy rather than standalone solutions. This perspective helps reconcile the apparent conflict between medical treatment and dietary intervention by reframing them as cooperative rather than competing forces. And this cooperative model is increasingly being explored in modern preventive cardiology as researchers attempt to understand how multiple small interventions accumulate into meaningful long-term cardiovascular protection. However, it is important not to overstate the evidence, because while associations between diet quality and cardiovascular outcomes are strong, causation for specific plaque reversal claims remains under investigation. This is why cardiologists often emphasize consistency over intensity, encouraging sustainable dietary patterns rather than extreme short-term changes that are difficult to maintain. Over time, these small, consistent behaviors may contribute to measurable improvements in vascular health markers, especially when combined with appropriate medical treatment and regular monitoring. We are therefore left with a more nuanced understanding of cardiovascular health, where foods, medications, and lifestyle factors interact in complex but meaningful ways that science is still working to fully decode. Ultimately, the discussion is not about replacing one approach with another, but about understanding how different strategies may converge to support long-term arterial health in ways that are still being actively researched and debated within modern clinical and nutritional science literature today. If you ask most people what causes heart disease, you'll usually hear the same answers. Cholesterol, saturated fat, maybe genetics. And if the conversation goes a little deeper, inflammation and blood pressure enter the picture. But there is another layer that rarely gets the attention it deserves, even though it quietly influences every stage of cardiovascular health. It's not a single marker, it's not a single organ. It's a network of biological systems working together in the background of your body every second of the day. And when this system becomes disrupted, everything from inflammation to plaque stability to blood vessel function begins to shift in the wrong direction. One of the most overlooked players in this entire process is the gut microbiome. Inside your digestive system lives a vast ecosystem of bacteria that doesn't just help digest food. It actively communicates with your immune system, influences inflammation levels, and even affects how your body processes fats and sugars. When this microbial balance is healthy, it supports metabolic stability. When it is disrupted, it can contribute to systemic inflammation that quietly affects your arteries over time. This connection surprises many people because the gut and the heart seem unrelated at first glance. But modern research shows that metabolites produced by gut bacteria can travel through the bloodstream and influence vascular health directly. Some of these compounds may promote inflammation, while others may help reduce it. The balance between them plays a role in long-term cardiovascular risk. This is where dietary patterns become especially important. Foods rich in fiber, antioxidants, and omega-3 3 fatty acids can influence the composition of gut bacteria in ways that may favor reduced inflammation. On the other hand, highly processed diets low in fiber and high in refined sugars can shift the microbiome toward patterns associated with increased inflammatory signaling. But the gut microbiome is only one piece of a much larger hidden system. Another critical but often ignored pathway is nitric oxide production. Nitric oxide is a molecule produced by the lining of your blood vessels that helps them relax and expand. This process is essential for healthy blood flow and proper regulation of blood pressure. When nitric oxide levels are optimal, your arteries remain flexible and responsive. When they decline, blood vessels can become stiff and less efficient, increasing strain on the cardiovascular system. Certain foods and nutrients are known to support nitric oxide production indirectly by improving endothelial function and reducing oxidative stress. However, chronic inflammation, poor diet, and metabolic dysfunction can interfere with this pathway, reducing the body's ability to maintain vascular flexibility over time. And this brings us to a crucial but often misunderstood concept, the endothelial glycocalyx. This is a thin, gel-like layer that lines the inside of your blood vessels. It acts as a protective barrier, regulating what enters and exits the arterial wall. It also plays a role in reducing friction as blood flows through your vessels. When this layer is healthy, it helps protect against plaque formation and inflammation. When it becomes damaged, the inner lining of the arteries becomes more vulnerable to cholesterol accumulation and immune system activity. What makes this particularly important is that damage to this layer does not happen overnight. It is a gradual process influenced by blood sugar levels, inflammation, oxidative stress, and overall metabolic health. In other words, it reflects your long-term lifestyle more than any single dietary choice. This is why cardiologists increasingly emphasize patterns rather than isolated foods or nutrients. Because the real drivers of arterial health are not just what you eat in one meal, but how your body responds over months and years of repeated exposure to certain metabolic conditions. And there is one more hidden pathway that ties everything together: insulin resistance. When the body becomes less responsive to insulin, blood sugar levels begin to fluctuate more dramatically. Over time, this can increase inflammation, disrupt lipid metabolism, and accelerate vascular damage. Insulin resistance is often silent in its early stages, but its effects ripple across nearly every system involved in cardiovascular health. What makes insulin resistance especially important in this discussion is its connection to diet, activity level, and even gut health. It does not exist in isolation. It develops through a combination of factors that slowly reshape how the body processes energy. When you connect all these pathways together, a clearer picture begins to emerge. Heart health is not controlled by one number or one nutrient. It is shaped by a complex interaction between inflammation, gut bacteria, vascular function, metabolic health, and long-term dietary patterns. And while medications like statins play an important role in managing risk, they operate within only one part of this system. Nutrition, on the other hand, interacts with multiple layers at once. This is why certain foods continue to attract scientific interest, not because they are miraculous, but because they influence several of these hidden pathways simultaneously. And once you understand how interconnected these systems are, the conversation about arterial plaque becomes much less about quick fixes and much more about long-term biological balance. That is the part most discussions still miss, and the part that changes everything about how you think of heart health moving forward.